Chapter 7. A Big Name. By the middle of the 1970s, cosmologists everywhere knew about Stephen because of his work on black holes. Ordinary people in Britain began to hear his name more after he was on British TV in Professor Hawking's Universe in the 1980s. Stephen also got an important British award called a CBE in 1982. After he got that award, he was often on TV and in the newspapers, first in Britain and then around the world. Of course, for many people, the story of Stephen's life was as interesting as his ideas about physics. He was so clever, but he had a body with terrible disabilities. He could understand the universe, but he could not move his arms or legs. And after 20 years with a deadly disease, he was still alive. Stephen Hawking's story was wonderful, but people also loved him as a person. He could explain difficult ideas in science, and when he talked about them, they became interesting. He always had a funny, clever reply for every question, too. Explaining science on TV gave Stephen a great idea. He decided to write a book about cosmology for ordinary people, not scientists. Many people said that it was not possible. They did not think that anyone would want to read a book like that. But Stephen did not listen. When Stephen began to work on his book, A Brief History of Time, in 1982, he spoke the words to someone who wrote them for him. But after he lost his voice in 1985, he had to finish the book on his voice computer, writing very, very slowly. Stephen also needed to change some pages of the book again and again, because he wanted ordinary people to understand it easily. At last, in 1988, after a lot of very hard work, the book was ready. And when it began selling in the shops later that year, people loved it. More than 10 million people bought A Brief History of Time, and you can now read it in 40 different languages. Stephen travelled a lot to talk about the book, and in many towns around the world, people waited for hours to see him. Stephen still gets letters and emails about A Brief History of Time today. Readers write to him and say how much they enjoyed it. So why did people like A Brief History of Time so much? Perhaps because it asked many important questions, and because people who read it understood for the first time how wonderful our universe really is. many young people became interested in science, and perhaps became scientists because of Stephen's book. Since A Brief History of Time, Stephen has written more science books for ordinary readers, and a book about his life called My Brief History. Stephen wants children to understand science and cosmology too. So he has written some books for children with his daughter, the writer Lucy Hawking. In the books, a young boy called George travels around the universe with his friends. He visits places like black holes and does some wonderful things. The books are great stories, but they are also science books. They explain physics and cosmology in an easy way for children. Stephen Hawking's theories, books, and life story have made him one of the most famous people on Earth. People from newspapers and the TV are always asking to talk to him, and his office in Cambridge is often full of cameras. People do not just want to know what Stephen thinks about cosmology. They ask him for his ideas about anything, from computers to football and pop music. Stephen likes to make jokes too, and he has been on TV in The Simpsons and The Big Bang Theory. There are also 2 great films about his life. It is not always easy to be famous, but because everyone knows Stephen's name, he can do many things that are important to him. Speaking against wars and helping children with disabilities, for example. Since the 1960s, Stephen and Jane have worked hard to help people with ALS. Jane has visited people with the disease in their homes, and Stephen and Jane have done many things to get money for ALS charities. Being famous has helped their work. Before Stephen became ill, not many people knew about ALS, but now a lot of people have heard about it. Today, ALS charities are working to try to stop this terrible disease, and people have given millions of pounds to help them. In the 1980s and 1990s, Stephen travelled all over the world to give lectures and meet with scientists. When he travelled, he also often met with groups of children who had disabilities. He answered their questions, told them stories from his life, and gave them hope. Since 1990, he has worked with a charity called SOS Children's Villages too. The charity helps children who have no mothers and fathers and tries to give them a better future. On the 29th of August 2012, Stephen spoke at the opening of the London Paralympic Games. More than 62,000 people were there that night, and millions more were watching on TV around the world. At the opening, Stephen talked about how nobody is ordinary. Everyone is different. And he said that everyone can be good at something. Even people who have very difficult lives. Stephen has shown this, and there are not many people in the world, with or without disabilities, who have become as important or as famous as him. Chapter 8. Family Life. In December 2014, Stephen and Jane Hawking went to London for the first night of a new film about their lives, The Theory of Everything. The film was made from a book by Jane. Felicity Jones played Jane, and Eddie Redmayne played Stephen. And he won an Oscar and many other awards for it. Stephen and Jane smiled for photos with the stars of the film, and they looked very happy when they went down the red carpet and into the cinema. But life has never been easy for them, and The Theory of Everything showed people that. When Jane married Stephen, she knew that he had ALS. They both thought that Stephen would not live very long, but they wanted to be together and have a family. In 1967, Stephen and Jane's first child, Robert, was born. And a few years later, they had a daughter called Lucy. Stephen could not do many ordinary things with the children. He could not take them to school or play with them in the garden. But he tried to be a good father, and he loved being with his children. Stephen and Jane's third child, Tim, was born in 1979. He was much younger than the other Hawking children, and by this time Stephen was already using a wheelchair, and he could not speak very much. For the first years of Tim's life, he could not really understand his father's voice. He and his father could only have a real conversation after Stephen got his voice computer. But Tim and Stephen spent a lot of time together. Like his father, Tim enjoyed making jokes, and he liked driving his father's wheelchair around the house. At that time, it was not easy to live in a place like Cambridge if you had to use a wheelchair. When Jane and Stephen went out, they had problems with holes in the roads, places that had no space for a wheelchair, and buildings with lots of stairs. They often had to ask for help when they wanted to go into a shop or just cross the street. So they decided to fight for the needs of people with disabilities, and they wrote letters to newspapers and to important people. They also went out in the streets with other people who had disabilities and their families, and called for change. All all around Britain, groups of people with disabilities talked about how difficult life was for them. And slowly, more people began to listen to their needs. Roads and buildings all around Britain began to change, and at last, people with disabilities could use them more easily. Stephen needed a lot of help all day and night, and he often had to go into hospital. For many years, Jane was studying for a PhD, but she also had to look after the children, wash and dress Stephen, tidy the house, cook, and give Stephen his food one piece at a time. And when it was time for bed, Jane and another helper had to carry Stephen up the stairs. When Stephen, Jane, and the children were in America in 1974, a PhD student lived with the family and helped at home. Stephen and Jane thought that this was a good idea. So back in Britain, for many years, different PhD students lived with them in their house in Cambridge and looked after Stephen with Jane. Nurses and other people visited them all the time too. So the house was always full of people. It was not easy for the Hawkings to be alone, and they could not have an ordinary family life. Stephen and Jane's marriage came to an end in 1990. In 1995, Stephen married his nurse, Elaine Mason, and they were together for 11 years. He now lives alone, but people visit his house and look after him 24 hours a day. Jane married again in 1997, but she is still good friends with Stephen. They often meet and see their children together, and they have grandchildren now too. Lucy and Tim Hawking went with their mother and father to the first night of the film The Theory of Everything. They watched when Eddie Redmayne danced with Felicity Jones, the woman in the film who played their mother. They watched when a young Stephen Hawking rode a bicycle, went out in a boat, and enjoyed himself with friends. And when Tim sat there in the dark cinema, he cried a little, because he never saw his father do those things in real life. Chapter 9. Into the Future. In February 2016, some cosmologists discovered what happens when two black holes meet. Stephen was not one of these scientists, but people wanted to know what he thought about the news. What does it mean? They asked. How important is this? Stephen explained the cosmologists' work and why it was important in a way that ordinary people could understand. People around the world are always interested in Stephen's ideas. We listen to Stephen Hawking because he is one of the greatest thinkers of our time. Stephen has never stopped asking questions and trying to understand our wonderful universe. When he began his work on black holes, many people asked, "Are black holes real or not?" But today, scientists think that there are black holes everywhere in space. There is even a black hole in the center of our galaxy, and it is bigger than 1,000,000 suns. Are Stephen's other theories right too? We still do not know, and we will not know for many years. But one thing is sure. Stephen Hawking's ideas have explained many important things in physics and cosmology. Cosmologists like Stephen know that we live on an ordinary planet, near an ordinary star, in an ordinary galaxy. They say that our galaxy is one of billions out there in space. Perhaps life is ordinary too, but Stephen thinks that people are not ordinary, because we have science. Because of science, we have learned how to look at the world around us and ask questions. We have begun to understand what the universe is, how it began, and why we are here. And because of this, Stephen thinks that we are very special. Science has changed the lives of everyone on Earth, and Stephen thinks that it is very important for our future. But science can also bring dangers, he says. We are building robots that are better and better all the time, and Stephen thinks that perhaps one day somebody will use robot soldiers which can kill millions of people in a war. Scientists are also trying to make computers which can think. But when we build them, will these computers become cleverer than us? We must be careful and learn how to use these computers, Stephen thinks, before they learn how to use us. But Stephen has a lot of hope for the future too. He thinks that one day people will build wonderful new machines and travel through the galaxy. They will discover new worlds and will perhaps decide to live far away from Earth. Stephen wants to go into space himself one day, and he already has a ticket. He wants to be one of the first passengers on a special new space plane, which will take ordinary people into space for a short time and then bring them back again. It will be a dangerous journey, but Stephen wants to go because he wants more people to be interested in space travel. In 2007, Stephen flew in another special plane from the Kennedy Space Center in the USA. The plane climbed high into the sky above Florida, then suddenly came down very fast. The people inside were falling to Earth, but the plane was flying down just as fast, so the passengers felt no gravity for about 25 seconds. Stephen loved the feeling of zero gravity. He smiled from ear to ear while his helpers turned his body around and around. The great scientist and thinker was flying.